everyone. So because we can't do our readings on Wednesdays like we were going to do starting again after spring break, we've decided to record our readings of each chapter that we have left in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I hope you're still reading along and you are able to keep up with that, but you can listen to these videos and keep up that way if you haven't been. All right, so this is Miss Stephanie, and I am reading chapter 10 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So here we go. The chapter is called The Spell Begins to Break. Now we must go back to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and the 3 other children. As soon as Mr. Beaver said, "There is no time to lose," everyone began bundling themselves into coats, except Mrs. Beaver, who started picking up sacks and laying them on the table and said, "Now, Mr. Beaver, just reach down that hand, and here's a packet of tea, and there's sugar and some matches. If someone will get 2 or 3 loaves out of the crocker over there in the corner." What are you doing, Mrs. Beaver?" exclaimed Susan. "Packing a load for each of us, dearie," she said very coolly. "You didn't think we'd set out on a journey without nothing to eat, did you?" "But we haven't time," said Susan, buttoning the collar of her coat. "She may be here any minute." "That's what I said," chimed Mr. Beaver. "Get along with you all," said his wife. "Think it over, Mr. Beaver. She can't be here for a quarter of an hour at least." "But don't we want as big a start as we can possibly get," said Peter, "if we want to reach the stone table before her?" "You've got to remember that, Mrs. Beaver," said Susan. As soon as she looks in here and she finds us all gone, she'll be off at top speed." "That she will," said Mrs. Beaver, "but we can't get there before her, so whatever we do, for she'll be on a sledge and we'll be walking." "Then we have no hope?" said Susan. "Now don't get fussing, there's a dear," said Mrs. Beaver. "But just get a half a dozen clean handkerchiefs out of that drawer. Of course, we've got hope. We just can't get there before her. But we can keep under cover and go by ways she won't expect, and perhaps we'll get through." "That's true enough, Mrs. Beaver," said her husband, "but it's time that we were out of this." "And don't you start fussing either, Mr. Beaver," said his wife. "There, that's better. That's 5 loads, and the smallest for the smallest of us. That's you, my dear," she added, looking at Lucy. "Oh, do please come on," said Lucy. "Well, I'm nearly ready now," answered Mrs. Beaver at last, allowing her husband to help her into her snow boots. "I suppose the sewing machine's too heavy to bring." "Yes, it is," said Mr. Beaver, "a great deal too heavy, and you don't think that you'll be able to use it while on the run, I suppose." "I can't abide the thought of that witch finding it," said Mrs. Beaver, "and breaking it or stealing it, as likely as not." "Oh, please, please, please do hurry," said the 3 children. And so at last they all got outside, and Mr. Beaver locked the door. "It'll delay her a little bit," he said, and they set off, all carrying their loads over their shoulders. The snow had stopped and the moon had come out when they began their journey, and they went in single file. First Mr. Beaver, then Lucy, then Peter, then Susan, then Mrs. Beaver last of all. Mr. Beaver led them across the dam and onto the right bank of the river, and then along a very rough sort of path among trees, right down by the river bank. The sides of the valley, shining in the moonlight, towered up from above them on either side. "Best keep down here as much as possible," he said. "She'll have to keep to the top, for you couldn't bring a sledge down here." It would have been a pretty enough scene to look at it through a window from a comfortable armchair, and even as things were, Lucy enjoyed it at first. But as they went on walking, and walking, and walking, and walking, and as the sack she was carrying felt heavier and heavier, she began to wonder how she was going to keep up at all. And she stopped looking at the dazzling brightness of the frozen river with all its waterfalls of ice, and at the white masses of the treetops, and the great glaring moon, and the countless stars, and could only watch the short little legs of Mr. Beaver going pad, 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 pad through the snow in front of her, as they were never going to stop. Then the moon disappeared, and the snow began to fall once more, and at last Lucy was so tired that she was almost asleep and walking at the same time, when suddenly she found that Mr. Beaver had turned away from the river bank to the right and was leading them steeply uphill into the very thickest bushes. And then, as she came fully awake, she found that Mr. Beaver was just vanishing into a little hole in the bank, which had been almost hidden under the bushes until you were quite on top of it. In fact, by the time she realized what was happening, only his short, flat tail was showing. Lucy immediately stooped down and crawled in after him. Then she heard noises of scrambling and puffing and panting behind her, and in a moment, all 5 of them were inside. "Wherever this is, said Peter's voice, sounding tired and pale in the darkness. I hope you know what I mean when I say pale sounding. It's an old hiding place for beavers in bad times, said Mr. Beaver, and a great secret. It's not much of a place, but we must get a few hours' sleep. If you hadn't all been in such a plaguey fuss when we were starting, I'd have brought some pillows, said Mrs. Beaver. It wasn't nearly such a nice cave as Mr. Tumnus's, Lucy thought. Just a hole in the ground, but dry and earthy. It was very small, so that when they all lay down, they were just all a bundle of clothes together. And what with that being warmed up by their long walk, they were really rather snug. If only the floor of the cave had been just a little smoother. Then Mrs. Beaver handed round in the dark a little flask out of which everyone drank something. It made one cough and splutter a little and stung the throat, but it also made you feel deliciously warm after you swallowed it, and everyone went straight to sleep. It seemed Lucy only the next minute, though, which really was hours and hours later, when she woke up feeling a little cold and dreadfully stiff, and thinking how she would like a hot bath. Then she felt a set of long whiskers tickling her cheek, and saw that the cold daylight coming in through the mouth of the cave. But immediately after that she was very wide awake indeed, and so was everyone else. In fact, they were all sitting up with their mouths and their eyes wide open, listening to a sound which was the very sound they'd all been thinking of, and sometimes imagining they heard. During their walk last night, it was the sound of jingling bells. Mr. Beaver was out of the cave like a flash the moment he heard it. Perhaps you think, as Lucy thought for a moment, that this was a very silly thing to do. But it was really a very sensible one. He knew he could scramble to the top of the bank among the bushes and brambles without being seen, and he wanted above all things to see which way the witch's sledge went. The others all sat in the cave waiting and wondering. They waited nearly 5 minutes. Then they heard something that frightened them very much. They heard voices. Oh, thought Lucy, he's been seen, he's been caught. Great there was surprise when a little later they heard Mr. Beaver's voice calling them from just outside the cave. It's all right, he was shouting. Come out, Mrs. Beaver, come out, sons and daughters of Adam. It's all right. It isn't her. This was bad grammar, of course, but that is how beavers talk when they're excited. I mean, in Narnia. In our world, they don't usually talk at all. So Mrs. Beaver and the children came bundling out of the cave, all blinking in the daylight and with earth all over them, and looking very frostly and unbrushed and uncombed, with the sleep still in their eyes. Come on, said Mr. Beaver, who was almost dancing with delight. Come and see. This is a nasty knock for the witch. It looks as if her power is already crumbling. What do you mean, Mr. Beaver? Panted Peter, as they all scrambled up the steep bank of the valley together. Didn't I tell you, answered Mr. Beaver, that she'd made it always winter and never Christmas? Didn't I tell you? Well, just come and see. And then they were all at the top, and they did see. It was a sledge, and it was reindeer, with bells on their harnesses, but they were far bigger than the witch's reindeer. And they were not white, but brown, and on the sledge sat a person whom everyone knew the moment they set eyes on him. He was a huge man in a bright red robe, bright as holly berries, with a hood that had fur inside it, and a great white beard that fell like a foamy waterfall over his chest. Do you guys know who it is? I bet you do. Everyone knew him because though you see people of his sort only in Narnia, you see pictures of them and hear them talked about all over the world. The world on this side of the wardrobe door. But when you see them in Narnia, it's rather different. Some of the pictures of Father Christmas in our world make him look like a funny, old, jolly man. But now the children actually stood looking at him. They didn't find it quite like that. He was so big and so glad and so real that they all became quite still. They felt very glad, but also solemn. I've come at last, he said. She has kept me out for a long time, but I've got in at last. Aslan is on the move. The witch's magic is weakening. And Lucy felt running through her that deep shiver of gladness which you only get when you are being solemn and still. And now, said Father Christmas, for your presents. There is a new and better sewing machine for you, Mrs. Beaver. I will drop it off in your house as I pass. If you please, sir, said Mrs. Beaver, making a curtsy. It's locked up. "Locks and bolts make no difference to me," said Father Christmas. "As for you, Mr. Beaver, when you return home, you will find your dam finished and mended with all the leaks stopped and a new Solstice gate fitted." Mr. Beaver was so pleased that he opened his mouth very wide, and then he found he couldn't say anything at all. "Peter, Adam's son," said Father Christmas. "Here, sir," said Peter. "These are your presents," was the answer. They are tools, not toys. The time to use them is perhaps near at hand. Bear them well." With these words, he handed to Peter a shield and a sword. The shield was the color of silver, and across there ramped a red lion, as bright as ripe strawberry at the moment when you pick it up. The hilt of the sword was gold, and it had a sheath and a sword belt and everything it needed, and it was just the right size and weight for Peter to use. Peter was silent and solemn as he received these gifts, for he felt they were a very serious kind of present. "Susan, Eve's daughter," said Father Christmas, "these are for you," and he handed her a bow and a quiver full of arrows and a little ivory horn. "You must use the bow only in great need," he said, "for I do not mean you to fight in the battle. It does not easily miss, and when you put this horn to your lips and blow it, then wherever you are, I think help of some kind will come to you." Last of all, he said, "Lucy, Eve's daughter," and Lucy came forward. He gave her a little bottle of what looked like glass, but people said afterwards that it was made of diamond, and a small dagger. "In this bottle," he said, "there is a cordial made of juice and some of the fire flowers that grow in the mountains of the sun. If you or any of your friends is hurt, a few drops of this will restore them. And the dagger is to defend yourself at great need, for you are also not to be in the battle." "Why, sir?" said Lucy. I don't know, but I think I could be brave enough." "That is not the point," he said, "but battles are ugly when women fight. And now, here," he suddenly looked less grave, "here is something for the moment for you all." And he brought out, I suppose from a big bag in his back, but nobody really quite saw him do it, a large tray containing 5 cups and saucers, a bowl lump of sugar, a jug of cream, and a giant big teapot, all sizzling and piping hot. Then he cried out, "Merry Christmas! Long live the true king!" and cracked his whip, and he and the other reindeer and the sledge and all were out of sight before anyone realized they had started. Peter had just drawn his sword out of the sheath and was showing it to Mr. Beaver when Mrs. Beaver said, now then, don't stand there talking till the tea's got cold. Just like men, come and help and carry the tray down and we'll have breakfast. What a mercy I thought of bringing the bread knife." So down the steep bank they went and back to the cave, and Mr. Beaver cut some of the bread and ham into sandwiches, and Mrs. Beaver poured out the tea, and everyone enjoyed themselves. But before long they had finished enjoying themselves, Mr. Beaver said, "Time to be moving on now." And that is the end of chapter 10. Be ready to read chapter 11. I believe Mrs. Otterf will be reading that for us. I will see you soon.